My name is Blair. I am 33 years old and I am the director of product at a major financial technology firm in Chicago. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to set hard boundaries with a toxic family. Trust me, you will want to hear exactly how this played out. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday night. I was hosting what was supposed to be a simple family dinner at my new condo in the downtown Loop. The salmon was barely out of the oven when my father Gary abruptly stood up, his face red with a familiar bubbling rage. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and slammed a crumpled piece of paper onto the counter. The loud smack echoed against the high ceilings of my apartment. "Look at it, Blair," my father demanded, pointing a trembling finger at the document. "Just look at what you are letting happen to your sister." I wiped my hands on a linen towel and glanced down. It was a default notice from a commercial bank. The number at the bottom of the page was staggering: $300,000. I kept my face perfectly neutral, a survival skill I had perfected over 3 decades of dealing with their emotional manipulation. "This looks like a default notice for a small business association loan," I said calmly. "What does this have to do with me?" My mother Susan immediately started crying. It was her signature move whenever she wanted to control a narrative. She gripped the edge of the quartz island, her knuckles turning white. "Whitney's event planning business is going under, Blair. She and Dion are drowning in debt. The bank is threatening to seize their business assets. They need cash right now, or they are going to lose absolutely everything." I looked past my parents into the living room. My sister Whitney was sitting on my expensive Italian leather sofa, dabbing her completely dry eyes with a tissue. Next to her was her husband Dion, staring intently at his smartphone, as if this massive financial crisis was merely a minor inconvenience. Dion always played the part of the wealthy cryptocurrency investor. He drove a leased G-Wagon and wore designer clothes, but the reality of his finances was always a heavily guarded secret. "So you brought this drama to my house, why exactly?" I asked, crossing my arms over my chest. "Because you have the money to fix this," my father shouted, his voice vibrating against the floor to ceiling windows. "You just got that massive promotion at your tech firm. You live in this ridiculous luxury apartment. Your sister is 30 years old and trying to build a future. You need to write a check and clear this debt today. We are family, Blair. You owe her this much." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "I owe her this. Let us get some basic facts straight. I work 60 hours a week managing data and financial products to earn my living. Whitney throws lavish parties and calls it a corporate business. And let us talk about how she and Dion are currently drowning in extreme poverty." I walked over to the sofa, grabbed the television remote, and cast my phone screen directly to the 75-inch display mounted on the wall. "What are you doing?" Whitney snapped, suddenly sitting up straight and dropping the tissue. "Just doing a quick financial audit," I replied. I opened the Instagram application and clicked on Whitney's public profile. A high-definition video from exactly 2 weeks ago started playing on the big screen. It showed Whitney and Dion clinking crystal champagne glasses in a private overwater bungalow in the Maldives. "You claim you are completely broke and facing a $300,000 business default," I said, raising an eyebrow at her. "But 14 days ago, you were enjoying a 2-week luxury vacation at a resort that costs roughly $3,000 a night. And Dion, is that a brand new Rolex Daytona on your wrist in that photo from last Tuesday?" Dion quickly shoved his left hand deep into his pocket, his jaw tight. "You do not understand how high-level business networking works, Blair. We had to keep up appearances to secure new private investors. Keeping up appearances is not a recognized tax write-off, Dion." I fired back without missing a single beat. "You two live way beyond your means, and now the ultimate bill is due. I am not writing a massive check to fund your delusions of grandeur." My father slammed his hand on the counter again, making the wine glasses rattle. "How dare you speak to them like that? You are a selfish, cold-hearted girl. I am telling you right now, Blair. You will pay off this loan or you are dead to us. You will no longer be a part of this family. Choose right now. I looked at my mother, who was nodding vigorously in agreement. I looked at Whitney, who wore a smug little smile, confident that I would cave just like I always did when we were kids. But I was not a scared child anymore. I looked my father dead in the eye. I choose my bank account. There is the door. Get out of my house. My mother dropped her face into her hands, her shoulders shaking in a dramatic display of grief that I had seen 1,000 times before. She peeked through her fingers to ensure I was watching her performance. "Blair, please," she sobbed, the sound echoing artificially in the quiet of my apartment. "You cannot do this to us, to your own flesh and blood. Do you want your sister out on the streets with a baby on the way? A baby." I stared at Whitney. Her flat stomach was perfectly encased in a silk designer blouse. The pregnancy card was a new addition to their arsenal of lies, clearly deployed as a desperate last-minute maneuver to extract $300,000 from my checking account. I ignored my mother's theatrics and picked up the crumpled final notice from the quartz island. I smoothed out the heavy stock paper. It was a formal communication from First Horizon National Bank regarding a defaulted Small Business Association loan. The primary borrower was listed as W&D Elite Events LLC. Below that were the standard boilerplate legal warnings about asset seizure and impending foreclosure on commercial property. But it was the third paragraph that made my blood run completely cold. My eyes scanned the dense block of legal text, stopping at a specific line detailing the liability structure. The words were printed in stark, undeniable black ink. Liability is held jointly and severally by the primary borrowers and the secondary guarantor. I moved my finger across the page to the signature block. There, right below Dion's chaotic scrawl and Whitney's loopy cursive, was a signature. It was my name, Blair Kensington. Except it was not my signature. The B was too rounded and the loop on the K was entirely wrong. It was a clumsy, desperate forgery. The kind of forgery someone might attempt if they had spent 30 years studying my handwriting on birthday cards and school assignments, but lacked the muscle memory to pull it off under pressure. My heart hammered against my ribs, but the icy calm that had kept me alive in this family immediately took over. I looked up from the document. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on us. My father was glaring at me, arms crossed, waiting for my capitulation. My mother was still fake crying, wiping non-existent tears from her perfectly powdered cheeks. I tapped the paper with my index finger. "Who signed my name on this document?" I asked. My voice was dangerously quiet. "What are you talking about?" my father barked, stepping forward. "Do not try to change the subject, Blair. You are the only one with liquid capital right now. We need that check cleared by tomorrow morning." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply slid the paper across the island toward him. "I am talking about the guarantor signature on this Small Business Association loan. Someone forged my name." Whitney shifted uncomfortably on the leather sofa, crossing and uncrossing her legs. Dion suddenly found his shoes incredibly fascinating, refusing to make eye contact. "You are being dramatic," my mother snapped, her tears instantly vanishing. She stood up, smoothing her skirt. "We just needed a co-signer because Whitney's business is so new. Your credit score is nearly perfect. We knew you would not mind helping your sister secure her future. We were going to tell you eventually. You stole my identity." I stated the reality of their crime settling over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. "You committed federal bank fraud. It is not fraud if it is family," my father yelled, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "We raised you. We put a roof over your head. You owe us your success. If it were not for the stability we provided, you would not be sitting in this fancy apartment with your executive job. Your sister needed a boost, and we used the resources available to us. Now stop being a selfish brat and pay the debt before they ruin her credit." I stared at the three people standing in my kitchen. They were not my family. They were parasites who had spent my entire life feeding off my energy, and now they were coming for my financial security. The absolute audacity of their entitlement was breathtaking. They had forged my signature on a $300,000 federal loan, and their only concern was that I was not eagerly paying it off for them. You do not understand how serious this is. Dayon finally spoke up, his voice tight. The bank is aggressive, Blair. If they do not get their money, they are going to come after all of us. You are legally bound to this debt now. No, Dayon. I am not legally bound to a forgery, I replied, picking up the document and folding it carefully. I placed it into the pocket of my blazer. Give that back! My father demanded, lunging forward. I stepped back, holding up a hand. If you take one more step toward me, Gary, I will have the building concierge call the police and have you arrested for trespassing, and then I will hand this document straight to the authorities. The room fell dead silent. The power dynamic had shifted in a fraction of a second, and they all felt it. I was no longer the quiet, compliant daughter they could bully into submission. I was the person holding the physical evidence of their felony. I looked at each of them, committing their panicked, desperate expressions to memory. My father was the first to break the silence, puffing out his chest, as he took a heavy step forward, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me. You are not handing anything to the authorities, he growled, pointing a thick finger at my face. You are going to write a check, clear the balance, and then we will discuss how to properly manage your sister's business accounts moving forward. I let out a short, incredulous laugh. Manage her accounts? You mean continue to use my name and credit history as your personal piggy bank? Absolutely not. I will not pay a single cent toward this fraudulent loan, and I am certainly not going to let you manipulate me into covering for a federal crime. Whitney suddenly threw herself back onto the cushions of my sofa, letting out a loud theatrical sob. You are destroying my life, she wailed, burying her face in her hands. I am trying to build a legacy for my child, and you are throwing a tantrum over a piece of paper. You have millions in stock options, Blair. $300,000 is nothing to you. You are just jealous because Mom and Dad always believed in my vision more than yours. Your vision is a scam. Whitney, I replied coldly, and clearly Mom and Dad did not believe in your vision either. Otherwise, they would have used their own credit to co-sign your loan instead of forging my signature. My mother gasped, clutching her pearls in a textbook display of suburban shock. How dare you speak to your sister that way, when she is in such a vulnerable state? We only used your name because our debt-to-income ratio was temporarily tied up in the country club renovations. It was a temporary measure. We are family. Family protects each other. Family does not commit identity theft. I countered, my voice echoing off the high ceiling of my kitchen. Family does not risk my freedom and my entire career because they want to fund luxury vacations and lease expensive cars. I am done protecting you. I am done being the financial safety net for your reckless behavior. My father's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The veins in his neck bulged against his stiff collar. He slammed his fist onto the quartz island so hard that the heavy marble fruit bowl rattled. You ungrateful wretch, he screamed, his voice cracking with fury. We gave you everything. We paid for your private tutors. We housed you. We fed you. If it were not for us, you would be nothing. He took another step closer, his breath hot and smelling of cheap scotch. You listen to me very carefully, Blair. You are going to clear this debt by tomorrow morning. If you walk out on us now, if you dare report this to the bank or the police, you are no longer my daughter. I will write you out of the will. I will make sure the entire extended family knows exactly how you abandoned your pregnant sister. You will be dead to us. He stood there, chest heaving, waiting for the familiar fear to wash over me. He expected the little girl who used to cry and beg for his approval to resurface and apologize. He expected me to shatter. Instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of profound relief. The invisible chains of guilt and obligation that had choked me for 33 years simply snapped. I looked at his red, angry face. I looked at my mother's fake tears and my sister's calculated pout. Fine by me, I said. The three words hung in the air, cold and absolute. My father blinked, entirely taken aback. "What did you just say?" I said, "Fine by me." I repeated, my tone devoid of any emotion. "Keep your inheritance. Keep the extended family. I do not care. I have built my own wealth, my own career, and my own life. I do not need you, and I certainly do not need the constant disrespect and financial abuse that comes with being your daughter. We are done." I walked over to the front door, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled it wide open. "Get out of my house," I commanded, "and do not ever contact me again." Whitney stopped crying instantly, her mouth dropping open in genuine shock. Dion grabbed her arm, realizing the situation was entirely lost, and pulled her toward the door. "You will regret this," my father spat, venom lacing every syllable as he marched past me into the hallway. "You are going to die alone, Blair." "I will take my chances," I replied smoothly. I slammed the heavy oak door shut right behind them, firmly and securely locking the metal deadbolt. I leaned against the heavy front door, listening to my father curse as the elevator closed down the hall. Most people would have collapsed onto the floor. Most would have poured wine, called a friend crying, and agonized over being disowned by their parents. But I was not most people. I was a data specialist who spent 60 hours a week hunting digital anomalies and securing financial networks. I did not have time for emotional breakdowns. I had a massive fraud to dismantle. I walked straight to my home office, bypassing the kitchen where the dinner I cooked was getting cold. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated the dark room. Within seconds, I was logged into my secure network. I bypassed the standard consumer credit websites and went through the direct portals I used for my job, pulling my comprehensive credit reports from all three major bureaus simultaneously: Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. I wanted everything. The reports loaded instantly. I scanned the lines of data, eyes moving rapidly over the familiar formatting. I had maintained a flawless 810 credit score since I was 25. I never missed a payment. I never carried high balances. But there it was, sitting like an infection right in the middle of my clean history. A $300,000 commercial loan originated 3 months ago through First Horizon National Bank. The status flashed a bright, urgent red: delinquent. I clicked on the trade line to expand the details. The primary borrowers were listed as Whitney and Dion, but my name was cemented underneath as the unconditional guarantor. I downloaded the full origination packet using a backdoor access portal I occasionally used for deep-level risk assessment at work. The PDFs populated on my screen. I stared at the digital copy of the application. The forgery of my signature was bad enough, but as I scrolled through the supporting documents, the depth of their betrayal became breathtakingly clear. They had not just forged my name on a single line, they had submitted a comprehensive package to the bank. There were copies of my previous W-2 tax forms, my current pay stubs, and my state-issued identification. I paused, racking my brain to figure out how they had acquired such sensitive documents. Then the memory hit me like a physical blow. 4 months ago, my mother had called me in a panic, claiming their estate lawyer needed my current financial details to update the family trust and ensure I was listed as an equal beneficiary. Like an absolute fool, I had compiled a secure folder and emailed it directly to her. They had weaponized my trust to build a fraudulent loan application. I felt a cold, sharp anger crystallizing in my chest. I opened a new encrypted folder on my desktop and named it First Horizon Fraud. I began dragging every piece of evidence into it: the loan application, the forged signature, the IP addresses stamped on the digital submission receipts. I noticed something interesting about the IP address used to finalize the digital portion of the application. I ran a quick trace on the numbers. It did not originate from Whitney and Dion's luxury apartment in the suburbs. The geographic tag pinned the location exactly to my parents' house in Oak Brook. My father had likely sat at his own mahogany desk, uploaded my stolen tax documents, and clicked submit on federal bank fraud. I kept digging. I opened the Illinois Secretary of State Business Search Portal and typed in W&D Elite Events LLC. The company registration popped up. It was formed only 2 weeks before the loan was approved. It had no operating history, no legitimate revenue streams, and no physical office space. It was a complete shell company created for the sole purpose of extracting $300,000 from a commercial lender, using my pristine credit profile as the golden ticket. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the digital paper trail. The data told a completely different story than the one my mother tearfully presented in my kitchen. This was not a desperate mistake made by a struggling business owner. This was a calculated, premeditated financial crime orchestrated by 4 people who thought I was too weak and desperate for their love to fight back. They assumed I would simply absorb the massive debt to keep the peace. I checked the time displayed on my computer screen. It was now almost midnight. I had everything I needed. The emotional shock had completely evaporated, replaced by the clinical precision of a corporate executive preparing for war. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts to find the direct number of my corporate attorney. I pressed the call button for Thomas, the senior legal counsel who handled my equity contracts. It was past midnight, but I paid a heavy retainer for a reason. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and alert. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told him someone had stolen my identity to secure a commercial loan, and I was sending an encrypted file to his secure server immediately. I heard the clatter of a keyboard on his end. "Send it through," he said, his professional tone kicking in. I hit send and waited while he opened the folder. I walked into my kitchen and poured myself a glass of ice water, taking slow sips to maintain my focus. The silence on the phone lasted for 3 full minutes. I could hear him clicking through the PDFs, stopping to examine the digital timestamps and the forged signature block. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made the severity of the situation incredibly real. "Blair, this is not a simple credit card dispute." He began, choosing his words carefully. "This is a $300,000 commercial loan backed by the Small Business Association. It is a federal matter. Who exactly is W&D Elite Events?" I told him the truth. It is a shell company created by my sister and her husband, and the IP address used to submit the final application matches my parents' residential address in Oak Brook. They orchestrated this together. There was another long pause on the line. Thomas sighed heavily through the phone speaker. "I need you to understand exactly what you are dealing with here," Thomas explained. "If you authorize me to file a formal fraud report with First Horizon National Bank, this stops being a family dispute and becomes a criminal investigation. The bank will immediately freeze all associated accounts to mitigate their losses. They will flag this to federal regulators because of the Small Business Association involvement. It constitutes wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft." "I know," I replied, my voice completely steady. Thomas pressed further, wanting to ensure I was not acting purely out of anger. "If we pull this trigger, the collateral tied to the guarantors will be targeted. Your parents likely leveraged their own assets to back whatever portion of the loan your credit profile did not cover. If this is exposed as a fraudulent application, the bank will accelerate the loan. They will demand the $300,000 immediately. If your parents cannot pay it in cash, the bank will foreclose on their house. They will lose their home, Blair. There is no going back once I file this paperwork." I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my living room and looked out at the glittering Chicago skyline. I thought about the decades of emotional manipulation. I thought about how my father had just stood in this exact room and threatened to disown me if I did not blindly pay for my sister's reckless lifestyle. I thought about how they had stolen my tax returns and forged my name without a single second of hesitation. They had gambled my freedom and my career to fund their fake luxury lifestyle. "Thomas," I said, leaning my forehead against the cool glass. "My parents made their choice the moment they decided my financial ruin was an acceptable price to pay for my sister's comfort. They did not care if I lost everything. They were fully prepared to let my credit crash and my career burn just so my sister could take trips to the Maldives. They crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. I am not going to set myself on fire to keep them warm. Are you absolutely certain? He asked one final time. I want you to sleep on this. It is a massive step. I shook my head even though he could not see me. I do not need to sleep on it. I have never been more certain of anything in my entire life. Draft the affidavit of forgery. Contact the fraud department at First Horizon National Bank first thing in the morning. Send copies of everything to the federal investigators. Light the match, Thomas. Let it all burn down. Very well, he replied, his tone shifting into absolute legal warfare mode. I will have the documents ready for your digital signature by 6 in the morning. Get some rest, Blair. Tomorrow is going to be a very long day. He disconnected the call. I put my phone down on the counter and looked around my quiet apartment. I had given the green light to initiate the fraud report. The wheels of justice were officially in motion, and there was absolutely nothing my toxic family could do to stop the avalanche that was about to hit them. 2 days later, the reality of my actions hit my family like a freight train. It was Thursday morning, and I was standing in the middle of our open plan floor at the fintech firm, reviewing a quarterly risk assessment with my engineering team. The office was a quiet hum of productivity, filled with the soft clatter of keyboards and low murmurs of corporate strategy. That peace shattered instantly when the heavy glass doors of the main lobby swung open, and my sister's voice echoed across the polished concrete floors. How could you do this to me, Blair? I turned to see Whitney marching past the reception desk, pushing her way through the security turnstiles by tailgating an intern. Dion was right behind her, wearing his signature designer sunglasses indoors, looking tense but fully committed to the performance. Every single head on the floor turned. Conversations abruptly halted. Analysts, developers, and junior executives stopped what they were doing and stared at the spectacle unfolding in our usually pristine corporate environment. Whitney stopped about 10 feet away from my desk, her face arranged into a mask of pure, unadulterated agony. Her designer handbag slipped from her shoulder, intentionally dropping to the floor for dramatic effect. She let out a loud, theatrical sob that was perfectly calibrated to reach the ears of the senior partners in the corner offices. You called the bank and lied to them, Whitney screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. You told them I stole from you. You froze our business accounts. How could you be so incredibly vicious to your own flesh and blood? I calmly closed my laptop and handed the risk assessment tablet to my lead engineer. He looked at me with wide eyes, unsure of how to react to this chaotic invasion. I did not shrink away. I did not whisper and beg her to step into a conference room to save face. That was exactly what she wanted. She wanted me to be so embarrassed by the public scene that I would agree to whatever she demanded, just to make her leave. I am not having this conversation with you here, Whitney, I stated, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. You are trespassing. Dion stepped forward, holding his hands up in a placating gesture that was purely for the benefit of my watching coworkers. Come on, Blair, he said, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. We are family. We made a tiny administrative mistake with the loan paperwork, and instead of calling us, you try to destroy our entire livelihood. You are trying to put us on the street. An administrative mistake, I repeated, making sure the phrase carried all the way to the Human Resources Department. You mean forging my signature and committing federal identity theft? Whitney wailed again, clutching her stomach as if she were in physical pain. She dropped to her knees, a move she had undoubtedly practiced in front of a mirror. Please, Blair, she begged, looking around at my horrified colleagues, trying to recruit them to her side. Do not do this to me. I am pregnant. I am carrying your niece or nephew. My doctor says the stress is going to cause a miscarriage. You are literally making a pregnant woman homeless just because you are jealous of my marriage. Murmurs broke out across the office floor. Some of the newer employees looked at me with genuine shock, clearly falling for the act. To an outside observer, I looked like a wealthy, heartless corporate monster crushing a desperate pregnant sister over a minor money dispute. Whitney knew exactly how to play the victim, and she was putting on an Oscar-worthy performance. "Are you seriously going to stand there and let her cry on the floor?" Dion demanded, looking around the room to gather more sympathy. "Look at her. She is terrified. All we did was ask for a little help, and you sicked federal investigators on us. You are a monster, Blair. You have always been a monster." My manager, a no-nonsense woman named Kelly, stepped out of her office and walked toward us, her phone already in her hand. "Blair, do you need me to call building security?" she asked gently, keeping a wary eye on Dion. I looked down at Whitney, who was still clutching her perfectly flat stomach and forcing out loud, dry sobs. She peered up at me through her eyelashes, expecting me to crack under the pressure of public humiliation. "No, thank you," I said to my manager, my voice completely steady. "They brought this circus into my professional space, so I will end it here." I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I unlocked the bright screen with a quick upward swipe. I tapped the screen a few times to synchronize my device with the main presentation monitor hanging right above the engineering pods. The massive 75-inch display flashed blue for a fraction of a second before perfectly mirroring my phone screen. Whitney was still kneeling on the polished concrete floor, doing her absolute best to squeeze out a few more tears, entirely unaware of the digital guillotine I was about to drop on her carefully rehearsed performance. My colleagues watched the monitor closely, likely expecting me to show an angry email, a threatening text message, or perhaps a banking statement to defend myself against her wild accusations. Instead, I opened a high-resolution photograph of an itemized receipt. I had stumbled across this receipt just yesterday while auditing the fraudulent business expenses they had attempted to claim. The sleek minimalist logo, printed at the very top of the document, belonged to one of the most exclusive and outrageously expensive medical spas located in the Gold Coast neighborhood. I used my thumb and index finger to zoom in on the document so the text filled the entire display, making it absolutely impossible for anyone in the room to miss the critical details. The date printed clearly at the top of the invoice was exactly 3 days ago. The patient name was printed in bold black letters: Whitney Kensington. And right below that, highlighted by the digital cursor on my phone, was the specific treatment breakdown: 40 units of Botox cosmetic injectables, along with 2 full syringes of premium dermal filler. The total cost was billed at $1,200, paid in full with a credit card. I looked down at my sister. Her fake cries were suddenly catching in her throat as she noticed the shifting shadows in the room and realized what was glowing on the massive screen directly above us. "You claim I am causing you so much stress that you might lose your baby," I said, projecting my voice so every single person on the executive floor could hear the absolute truth of the situation. "You are standing in my place of work telling my colleagues that you are carrying my niece or nephew. But there is a massive, undeniable problem with your timeline, Whitney. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists strictly forbids pregnant women from receiving Botox or any cosmetic fillers due to the severe neurological risks to the developing fetus." I took a step closer to her, my tone completely clinical and devoid of any sisterly affection. No reputable medical professional in the entire state of Illinois would ever inject a pregnant woman with those substances. So we are left with only 2 possible scenarios here today. Either you are currently risking the life of your unborn child for a smooth forehead and plump lips, or you are completely faking a pregnancy to manipulate my coworkers and play the victim. Which one is it, Whitney? The silence in the office was deafening. The collective gasp from the marketing team sitting across the floor was entirely audible. The sympathetic whispers that had been floating around the room just moments ago instantly died, replaced by expressions of pure disgust and disbelief. Whitney scrambled to her feet, her face flushing a deep, violently embarrassed shade of crimson. She looked at the giant screen, then at the shocked faces of my colleagues, finally realizing her entire victim narrative had just been utterly obliterated by a $1,200 med spa receipt. She opened her mouth to speak, to try and spin another web of lies, but nothing came out. She was completely trapped by her own vanity. Dion grabbed her arm roughly, his own face dark with humiliation and rising panic. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. But he was no longer looking anyone in the eye. He knew they were completely exposed in front of dozens of highly educated corporate witnesses. Kelly, my manager, did not wait another second to take complete control of the situation. She raised her hand confidently, signaling the two large corporate security guards who had just stepped off the elevators in response to a silent alarm she had triggered at her desk earlier. "Please escort these two individuals out of the building immediately," Kelly instructed with unwavering authority. "If they refuse to leave the premises peacefully right now, you have my full permission to call the Chicago police and have them both arrested for trespassing." The armed guards flanked Whitney and Dion without any hesitation. My sister did not try to fight back this time. She hastily grabbed her designer bag from the floor and let Dion pull her toward the waiting elevators. Her head hung low, entirely stripped of all her fake, righteous indignation. I watched the heavy glass doors securely close. I walked over to the forensic analysis pod and pulled up a chair next to Ryan, our senior investigator. Ryan and I spent the last 3 years building predictive algorithms to detect complex money laundering schemes for corporate clients. He witnessed the spectacle in the lobby and looked at me with a raised eyebrow. I did not need to explain the family drama. I just needed his unparalleled expertise in tracing obfuscated digital assets. I asked him to help me run a deep dive on the First Horizon loan disbursement. I had already secured the routing and account numbers from the fraudulent application packet I downloaded the night before. Ryan nodded, his fingers flying across his mechanical keyboard. He bypassed standard commercial search engines and logged directly into a specialized financial ledger database we used for institutional risk auditing. Because the Small Business Association backed the loan, certain disbursement records and federal wire transfers were logged in clearinghouse databases our software could legally query for compliance checks. It was a gray area to run my own family members, but they dragged my personal identity into a commercial fraud matrix. I was legally entitled to investigate the liability attached to my stolen name. The screen flashed as lines of transaction data began to populate. We were looking at the master ledger for W&D Elite Events, LLC. The initial deposit of $300,000 landed in the account exactly 89 days ago. I leaned in closer, scanning the outflow column. If Whitney was telling the truth about a failing event planning business, the ledger should have been filled with standard corporate expenses. We should have seen outgoing payments to wholesale floral vendors, luxury venue deposits, catering companies, and local marketing agencies. There should have been payroll disbursements and insurance premiums. Instead, the operating expense column was completely empty. There was not a single payment made to any vendor associated with the hospitality industry. The business was an absolute ghost. It was a sterile holding account designed solely to receive the federal funds. Ryan let out a low whistle, pointing to the transaction history with his pen. "They did not spend a single dime on their actual business," he observed quietly. "They structured the withdrawals to avoid automatic banking alerts." I followed his pen down the screen. The money had not been lost in a bad business venture. It had been systematically drained out of the checking account over a period of exactly 3 weeks. The withdrawals were not random. They were highly calculated sequential wire transfers. $49,000 on a Tuesday. $49,000 the following Thursday. They were intentionally keeping individual wire amounts just under the $50,000 threshold that automatically triggered a manual review by the Commercial Fraud Department. It was a classic structuring technique used by financial criminals to move illicit funds. Ryan ran a trace on the destination routing numbers attached to the outgoing wires. They were not going to a domestic savings account or a standard investment portfolio. Every single transfer was being routed through a digital payment processor known for extremely lax regulatory oversight. The money was leaving the traditional banking system entirely. It was being converted into a format infinitely harder to track, freeze, or recover. My sister and her husband had not defaulted on a business loan because they were bad at managing money. They had intentionally engineered a massive heist. We watched the final wire transfer process on the glowing monitor screen. The corporate LLC account was officially drained down to an absolute zero balance. I sat back in my leather office chair, staring quietly at the empty digital ledger. The grim realization washed over me in cold, real time. The $300,000 was completely gone, swallowed whole by the untraceable digital ether. But Ryan was unequivocally the absolute best forensic data tracer operating in the entire city of Chicago. He cracked his knuckles loudly and opened a new secure terminal window, completely ready to follow the hidden international footprints. Ryan did not hesitate for a single second. He began running a complex series of algorithmic scripts designed specifically to bypass the standard encryption walls of offshore payment gateways. The terminal window turned into a blur of scrolling green text as his program pinged servers across multiple international jurisdictions. I watched the reflection of the code dancing across his glasses, the quiet intensity in the room growing heavier with every passing minute. Most people believe that once money left the traditional American banking system, it was gone forever. They assumed digital wallets and offshore processors offered complete anonymity. But in the world of high-level financial technology, absolute anonymity is a myth. Every digital transaction leaves a faint electronic shadow, and Ryan was an absolute master at hunting those shadows. After 45 minutes of relentless coding, the rapid scrolling abruptly stopped. A single IP address and an international routing code locked onto the center of the screen. "Got it?" Ryan muttered, tapping his pen against the desk. He leaned closer to the monitor, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. The money did not stay in that shady payment processor. It bounced through 3 different temporary holding accounts in the Bahamas before landing in its final destination. He ran the final routing number through a global registry database we kept on secure servers. A corporate entity name finally flashed across the display. Apex Global Holdings Limited, registered in the Seychelles. "What kind of company is Apex Global?" I asked, pulling my chair closer to his desk. Ryan typed furiously for another 30 seconds, pulling up the public ledger attached to the Seychelles registry. "It is not a traditional company, Blair. It is a private, unregulated cryptocurrency exchange platform. The entire $250,000 was systematically converted from United States dollars into an untraceable stablecoin immediately upon arrival." The sheer audacity of the scheme hit me like a physical blow. Dion was not just a lazy grifter trying to fund a luxury lifestyle with his wife. He was running a sophisticated, premeditated money laundering operation. He knew exactly how to structure the wire transfers to avoid domestic banking alarms. And he knew exactly how to wash the fiat currency through an unregulated crypto exchange so the federal government could never claw it back. Whitney likely thought they were just securing a massive payday to fund her fake event planning business and buy more designer handbags. She was entirely oblivious to the high-level felony her husband was orchestrating right under her nose. But Ryan was not finished. He clicked on the registration documents for Apex Global Holdings. "If Dion is moving $250,000 into a private crypto wallet," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "he had to register a verified guarantor name with the Seychelles holding firm to establish the initial corporate account. Even unregulated exchanges require a human name attached to the master key for liability purposes." I held my breath as Ryan ran a decryption key against the public registration file. I fully expected to see Dion, or perhaps a clever pseudonym he used for his fake crypto investments. But as the decrypted text slowly populated on the screen, the name that appeared made my heart stop entirely. It was not Dion. It was not Whitney. The master account holder, the sole legal proprietor of the offshore cryptocurrency shell company, holding the stolen federal funds, was Gary Kensington, my father. I stared at the screen, reading the name over and over again, completely paralyzed by the revelation. Dion had not just stolen my identity to secure the initial loan, he had stolen the identity of my father to establish the offshore money laundering account. The brilliance and absolute evil of his plan became crystal clear in an instant. Dayon knew that by forging my name as the guarantor, the bank would approve the massive loan based on my pristine credit score. But he also knew that if the federal authorities ever tracked the missing money overseas, they would follow the digital paper trail straight to the final destination. By registering the crypto exchange account under the name of Gary Kensington, Dion had perfectly insulated himself from the ultimate federal fallout. When the FBI and the Internal Revenue Service inevitably came knocking for their missing $300,000, they would not be looking for the unemployed son-in-law. They would be looking directly at Gary. Dion had set his own father-in-law up to take the entire fall for a massive federal wire fraud conspiracy, completely ensuring that if anyone went to a federal penitentiary, it would be the arrogant patriarch of the family. He played my father like an absolute and total blind fool. I stared at the monitor, letting the magnitude of Dion's betrayal wash over me. He had not just stolen from a commercial bank. He had built a federal trapdoor and shoved my father right through it. Ryan turned to me, his eyes wide behind his glasses. "Should we call him?" he asked quietly. "Should we warn your dad about what his son-in-law just did?" I slowly shook my head. "No," I replied, my voice completely flat. "Let them reap exactly what they have sown." Before I could ask Ryan to print the encrypted offshore ledger, my smartphone buzzed violently against the desk. Then it buzzed again. And again. A rapid, endless stream of notifications lit up the screen in quick succession. I assumed it was Thomas, my corporate attorney, calling with an urgent update from the fraud department at the bank. I reached for the device and swiped it open. It was not Thomas. It was a tidal wave of social media notifications. My mother Susan had just detonated a nuclear bomb on Facebook. I opened the application and found her post completely dominating my feed. It was a massive, multi-paragraph essay written with the kind of theatrical martyrdom she had perfected over a lifetime. The post was accompanied by a carefully selected, highly filtered photograph of Whitney from 3 years ago, looking fragile and holding a bouquet of white roses. "To all our dearest friends and family," the post began. "It is with a completely shattered heart that Gary and I must share a devastating tragedy today. Our oldest daughter, Blair, has officially turned her back on us. After achieving immense corporate success in the city, the wealth has fundamentally changed her. She has become a cold, jealous narcissist who simply cannot stand to see her younger sister happy. Whitney is currently pregnant and trying to build a modest, small business to support her growing family. Instead of celebrating this beautiful joy, Blair used her corporate influence to illegally freeze Whitney's bank accounts today, leaving a pregnant woman terrified and completely destitute. We raised Blair to be loving and generous, but the greed has turned her into a monster. Please pray for our family during this incredibly dark time." The post already had hundreds of reactions, mostly angry faces and crying emojis. There were dozens of comments pouring in by the second. The flying monkeys had been officially unleashed. My phone began vibrating with direct text messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins who had not even bothered to call me on my birthday in over 5 years. Aunt Patricia sent a massive block of text. "I am absolutely disgusted by your behavior, Blair. How could you try to ruin your sister while she is carrying a child? You need serious psychiatric help. I am praying for your soul." My cousin Kevin, who was currently 30 years old and still living in his parents' basement, sent a separate message. "You always were an arrogant brat. Unblock their accounts right now and give them the money you owe them, or you are dead to all of us." Even my father's brother, Uncle Richard, left a scathing voicemail calling me a total disgrace to the family name and demanding I issue a public apology to my mother before the day was over. 5 years ago, an orchestrated public attack exactly like this would have broken me entirely. I would have spent hours crafting the perfect logical response, desperately trying to prove my innocence to people who were completely committed to misunderstanding me. I would have cried, doubted my own sanity, and probably written the $300,000 check just to make the public humiliation and the barrage of hateful messages stop. But today was different. I sat in my brightly lit office, looking at the glowing messages, and felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical amusement. They were so incredibly predictable. When toxic people can no longer control you, they will immediately try to control how other people see you. My mother actually thought this public smear campaign was her ultimate weapon. She thought she could weaponize our extended family to bully me into withdrawing the federal fraud report. I did not reply to a single message. I did not post a defensive comment on her tear-jerking essay. I did not try to convince Aunt Patricia or Uncle Richard of the actual truth. Arguing with them would only feed the drama and give my mother the attention she was so desperately craving. Instead, I calmly took high-resolution screenshots of the entire Facebook post. I captured every single toxic text message and carefully saved the angry voicemails. Ryan watched me quietly as I organized the digital files into a new secure folder on my phone. "Are you going to respond to any of them?" he asked, pointing at the screen. I smiled a genuine, completely relaxed smile. "Absolutely not," I said. "I am going to let my mother enjoy her little moment of sympathy. Let her soak up all the digital prayers and emotional support from her friends. Because very soon, a Facebook status is going to be the absolute least of her problems." I placed my smartphone face down on the desk, cutting off the endless stream of toxic notifications. The screen vibrated against the wood a few more times before I reached over and powered the device down entirely. I did not have the time or the energy to entertain the delusions of extended family members who only called when there was drama to consume. Let them believe whatever false narrative made them feel superior today. I turned my attention back to Ryan and the dual monitors glowing brightly in the dimly lit office. The offshore crypto trail was still laid out in stark, undeniable lines of code and transaction identifiers. Ryan had already initiated a secure export of the data, compiling the complex digital footprints into an encrypted master file. He handed me a physical flash drive containing the raw ledger logs. "This is absolutely everything," he said quietly. "The domestic wire transfers, the routing sequences, the conversion receipts, and the registration documents proving Gary Kensington is the master account holder at Apex Global." I plugged the small drive into my secure terminal and opened the master dossier. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting, detailing a financial crime so arrogant it practically solved itself. I organized the digital files chronologically to make it as simple as possible for a federal agent to read and understand. First, I attached the original First Horizon National Bank loan packet, clearly highlighting my forged signature and the fraudulent tax forms. Next, I added the Internet Protocol address trace, definitively proving the initial application was submitted directly from my parents' residential network. Then came the domestic banking records, showing exactly how Dion and Whitney meticulously structured the bank withdrawals in increments of $49,000 to bypass standard commercial fraud triggers. Finally, I placed the offshore crypto conversion receipts at the very top of the pile, clearly displaying my father as the ultimate beneficiary of the laundered federal funds. It was an ironclad narrative of sophisticated white-collar crime. There was absolutely no room for alternative interpretation. There were no emotional pleas or complex family dynamics to unravel. It was just raw, uncompromising math. I opened a secure encrypted browser window and navigated directly to the official online portal for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. While the commercial bank would handle the civil fraud regarding the forged signature, the Internal Revenue Service was the ultimate apex predator in the financial food chain. They did not care about tearful Facebook posts or who was considered the golden child of the suburban family. They cared only about tax evasion, money laundering, and the illegal movement of $250,000 into unregulated foreign markets. I filled out the whistleblower submission form meticulously. I detailed the exact nature of the Small Business Association loan fraud and provided the offshore routing numbers. I explained that the funds were actively being concealed from federal taxation and domestic banking oversight. In the supplementary evidence section, I uploaded the entire master dossier. I then opened a second secure tab for the Federal Bureau of Investigation White Collar Crime Division and submitted the exact same package specifically flagging the domestic wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. My hands did not shake. My heart rate remained perfectly steady as I stared at the monitors. I moved the cursor over the final submit button on both federal portals and clicked them simultaneously. The screens refreshed instantly, providing me with two long alphanumeric federal tracking codes. The point of no return was officially crossed. I stared at the screen, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over me. This was justice. Pure, absolute justice. The formal complaints were now registered in the permanent federal database, triggering automated alerts within the respective government agencies due to the high dollar amount and the direct involvement of federal Small Business Association funds. I copied the tracking numbers and forwarded them to Attorney Thomas in a brief encrypted email. He replied exactly 2 minutes later, confirming he was coordinating with the bank to accelerate the immediate asset freeze. I leaned back in my leather chair, exhaling a long, slow breath. Oh, the trap was meticulously set, and the steel jaws were already snapping shut. Out in the wealthy suburbs, my mother was likely refreshing her social media page, basking in the warm glow of fake internet sympathy, completely oblivious to the fact that I had just handed her entire life over to the federal government. They thought they had won the battle by taking the money and attempting to destroy my public reputation. But they were about to learn a brutal, irreversible lesson about how the real world operates when you steal from a financial technology expert. The countdown to their absolute ruin had officially begun. While I sat in the quiet hum of my office watching the federal confirmation codes glow on my monitors, my family was busy celebrating their imagined victory exactly 3 miles away. They had booked a corner booth at one of the most exclusive Michelin star steakhouses in the Gold Coast district. The heavy mahogany table was covered in the remnants of a wildly extravagant dinner. There were empty plates that previously held dry-aged Wagyu ribeyes, truffle-infused lobster macaroni, and towering iced seafood platters. 3 empty bottles of vintage Bordeaux wine sat near the centerpiece. They were feasting like royalty, completely funded by the delusion that they had successfully outsmarted me and secured $250,000 in untraceable cash. Susan was busy scrolling through her smartphone, a smug smile plastered across her face as she read the comments on her Facebook post out loud. Aunt Patricia says she is organizing a prayer circle for us at the country club tomorrow, my mother announced, taking a delicate sip of sparkling water. Uncle Richard commented that he is going to call Blair and demand she issue a formal apology to the entire family. I told you this would work, Gary. Public pressure always brings her back in line. She will be begging for our forgiveness by the weekend. Gary chuckled, swirling the last ounce of expensive red wine in his crystal glass. Let her stew in her own guilt for a few days, he said dismissively. She needs to learn respect. In the meantime, Dayon, I think we should look into expanding the business portfolio. If your event planning venture needs more capital next quarter, we can always leverage the house again. The market is incredibly strong right now. Dion nodded enthusiastically, completely, playing the part of the successful entrepreneur. Absolutely, Gary. The crypto markets are incredibly bullish right now anyway. I have some major investments maturing soon. We are practically printing money at this point. Whitney leaned her head on Dion's shoulder, smiling dreamily. I was thinking we should start looking at upgrading the car, she added. A Range Rover would be much safer for the baby than the G-Wagon. The waiter, a man dressed in a crisp white tuxedo jacket, approached the table, carrying a black leather presenter. He placed it discreetly next to Gary's elbow. The final bill for their lavish celebration came to just over $1,800. Gary barely glanced at the itemized receipt. He reached into his tailored suit jacket with a practiced arrogance, pulled out his heavy metal black card and dropped it onto the leather tray. Take care of that, Gary instructed, waving his hand dismissively. And keep the change. The waiter bowed slightly and walked toward the central point of sale terminal. The family continued chatting entirely relaxed and basking in the glow of their perceived triumph. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Gary was in the middle of explaining a golf swing technique to Dion when the waiter finally returned. The man looked incredibly uncomfortable, his professional demeanor slipping slightly. He leaned down and spoke in a hushed, discreet tone to avoid causing a scene in the elegant dining room. "Excuse me, sir," the waiter whispered, placing the black card back on the table. "I am terribly sorry, but your financial institution has declined the transaction." Gary stopped talking. He stared at the piece of metal on the table, then looked up at the waiter with a mixture of confusion and immediate irritation. "That is completely impossible." Gary snapped, his voice rising loud enough to catch the attention of the adjacent tables. "There is no preset spending limit on that account. You must have run it wrong." "Run it again." "I assure you, sir, I ran it 3 times." The waiter replied politely but firmly. "The terminal is returning a hard decline code indicating the account is currently restricted. Perhaps there is a fraud alert. Do you have another form of payment?" Gary's face flushed a deep, angry red. He snatched the card off the table. "This is ridiculous. It is a bank error. I will have my private wealth manager on the phone tomorrow to have your manager fired for this embarrassment." He turned to Dion. "Pay the bill, Dion. I will wire you the cash in the morning once I sort out these incompetent bank tellers." Dion laughed, eager to play the wealthy savior. "No problem at all, Gary. I got it." He pulled out a sleek silver credit card and handed it to the waiter. The waiter produced a handheld digital terminal from his apron and inserted Dion's card right there at the table. The machine beeped, processed for 3 seconds, and flashed a bright red warning screen. "Declined." Dion frowned, his confident smile faltering. Gary snatched his smartphone from the table, his face tight with fury. "This is unacceptable," he hissed, unlocking the device. "I am logging into my executive banking portal right now. I will transfer funds from our investment account. I am having the branch manager fired tomorrow morning for this incompetence." Susan patted his arm, looking nervously at the hovering waiter. "Just stay calm, Gary," she whispered. "It is just a systemic glitch. Our accounts are perfectly fine. We have millions in equity there." Gary launched the banking application. The blue loading icon spun for 2 agonizing seconds, then the screen illuminated. But instead of displaying his familiar 6-figure checking balance and his extensive stock portfolios, the entire application interface was permanently locked behind a solid, terrifying red banner. Gary stopped breathing. He stared at the screen, his eyes wide and unblinking. The bold white text stretched across the top of his phone, completely blocking any access to his funds. The message was absolutely unambiguous. "Accounts frozen. Pending federal investigation. Please contact the Department of Justice, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network immediately." Gary felt the blood drain entirely from his face. His hands began to shake so violently that the smartphone rattled against the edge of the table. Susan leaned over to see what was causing his sudden physical paralysis. She read the bright red banner out loud, her voice trembling with rising panic. "Federal investigation. Gary, what does that mean? Why is the government locking our family accounts?" Dion stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor. He pulled out his own phone and frantically opened his private cryptocurrency exchange application. The secure screen loaded, but the wallet balance was wiped completely clean. A similar alert immediately popped up. "Asset seizure protocol initiated by federal mandate." Dion looked like he was about to vomit right there in the middle of the elegant dining room. He realized instantly that the offshore money was gone. His brilliant laundering scheme was dead. The restaurant general manager, a tall man in a dark suit, suddenly appeared next to the waiter. "Is there a problem settling the bill tonight, gentlemen?" The manager asked, his tone polite but laced with sharp authority. Gary tried to speak, but his throat was completely dry. "My accounts," he stammered, looking up in sheer terror. "There is a misunderstanding. A massive misunderstanding. We cannot leave an $1,800 tab open, the manager stated firmly, crossing his arms. If you cannot provide a valid form of payment immediately, I am legally obligated to call the Chicago Police Department and report a theft of services. You will not be permitted to leave the premises until the authorities arrive. Whitney let out a quiet shriek, burying her face in her hands to hide from the staring restaurant patrons. Susan started hyperventilating, clutching her chest. Wait! Gary choked out, desperate to avoid being handcuffed in front of the city elite. Do not call the police. I have collateral. With shaking hands, Gary unclasped the vintage gold Patek Philippe watch from his wrist. It was worth at least $30,000. He dropped it onto the leather payment tray. Dion, take off your watch right now, Gary ordered, his voice cracking with sheer panic. Dion hesitated, staring at his brand-new Rolex Daytona. Take it off or you are going to jail tonight, Gary hissed viciously. Dion swallowed hard, unbuckling the heavy silver timepiece and tossing it next to Gary's watch. The manager looked down at the two luxury watches resting on the leather tray. He picked them up with a slow, calculating nod. We will hold these in the main floor safe until you return with the cash to settle your outstanding debt, he said coldly. You may leave now. Gary, Susan, Whitney, and Dion stood up from the table. Stripped of their money, their dignity, and their pride, they walked in complete silence toward the exit. The entire restaurant watched them go, witnessing the absolute and total collapse of their fake empire. The drive back to the Oak Brook suburbs was suffocating. Nobody spoke a single word. Dion gripped the steering wheel of his G-Wagon so tightly his knuckles were completely white, his eyes fixed on the dark highway. In the back seat, Whitney was quietly sobbing, the reality of the declined credit cards shattering her delusion of untouchable wealth. Susan sat perfectly rigid, staring out the window, quietly muttering to herself that it was all a massive computer error. Gary was frantically tapping his dead smartphone, desperately trying to bypass the federal lock screen on his banking application. He refused to accept the reality of the situation. He spent the entire 40-minute drive convincing himself that his private wealth manager would fix everything by 9 in the morning. He was Gary Kensington. He lived in a gated community. The federal government did not freeze the assets of people like him. Dion turned the luxury SUV onto their pristine, tree-lined street. The sprawling colonial mansions sat quietly under the amber glow of the streetlights. They pulled into the wide circular driveway of my parents' house. The massive brick estate looked exactly as it always did, projecting an aura of generational wealth and untouchable security. But as the headlights swept across the grand entryway, the illusion violently shattered. There was something taped to the custom mahogany front doors. It was a large document, encased in a clear plastic sleeve, disrupting the perfect symmetry of the expensive architecture. Dion parked the car, but nobody moved to get out. They all stared through the windshield, at the paper glowing in the headlights. A cold dread settled over the vehicle. Gary finally unbuckled his seatbelt, his breathing heavy and erratic. Gary marched up the stone steps, his heavy footsteps echoing in the suburban night. Susan, Whitney, and Dion followed closely behind, huddling together as if the cold night air were physically attacking them. Gary reached out and ripped the plastic sleeve off the door. He held it up to the porch light. It was a formal legal notice issued by the County Sheriff Department, executed on behalf of First Horizon National Bank. Gary read the bold black letters at the top of the page, his voice barely more than a dry rasp. Notice of immediate asset seizure and property lockout. Susan let out a sharp gasp, grabbing Gary's arm. What does that mean? She demanded, her voice shrill and panicked. Read the rest of it, Gary. What does it say? Gary's eyes darted across the dense legal text. Pursuant to the federal fraud investigation regarding the defaulted Small Business Association commercial loan, this property has been seized as secured collateral. Access to the premises is strictly prohibited. It was exactly what my corporate attorney Thomas had warned me about. Because Gary and Susan had leveraged the equity of their own estate to back the fraudulent loan, and because the loan was now flagged as a federal crime, the bank was legally authorized to accelerate the foreclosure and seize the collateral immediately to prevent capital flight. Gary dropped the paper onto the stone porch. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his heavy brass keyring, and jammed his house key into the deadbolt. He twisted it violently, but the key would not turn. He pulled it out and tried the bottom lock. Nothing. The internal tumblers had been completely replaced. The bank had already sent a locksmith to secure the asset. They were officially locked out of their own home. "Open the door!" Gary screamed, pounding his fists against the thick mahogany wood. "Open the door right now!" Susan began to wail hysterically, looking around wildly to see if any of the affluent neighbors were watching this humiliating spectacle from their windows. "We cannot be locked out," she cried, pulling at the brass handle. "All my clothes are in there, my expensive jewelry. We have absolutely nowhere else to go tonight." Whitney dropped to the ground, sitting on the cold stone steps, rocking back and forth in sheer panic. "You said you had this completely under control, Dad," she sobbed, glaring up at him. "You said Blair was just throwing a childish tantrum. Now we are completely homeless." Dion stood quietly at the bottom of the steps, slowly backing away toward his luxury vehicle. He realized, long before any of them, just how dangerously fast the federal authorities were actually moving. If the commercial bank had already seized the physical house and frozen all the liquid accounts, the federal criminal warrants were undoubtedly coming next. The toxic family stood entirely frozen on the dark porch of the newly locked mansion, completely surrounded by the wealthy neighborhood they used to rule, finally realizing the absolute terrifying magnitude of the legal war they had started. The morning sun crested over Lake Michigan, filling my downtown apartment with warm, bright golden light. I woke up feeling more rested than I had in years. The chronic tension that usually sat heavy in the back of my neck, a permanent side effect of being the family scapegoat, was completely gone. I walked into my immaculate kitchen, my bare feet quiet against the hardwood floor, and began my daily routine. I pressed the power button on my espresso machine, listening to the satisfying hum of the grinder. It was a perfectly normal, peaceful Friday morning, but I knew the digital world inside my smartphone was currently burning to the ground. I picked up the device from the wireless charging pad and tapped the screen. The notification center immediately flooded the display. 47 missed calls, all from Gary Kensington. I did not feel a single spike of anxiety. I opened the visual voicemail application and saw a cascade of audio files left over the course of the entire night. I poured a shot of rich dark espresso into my ceramic mug, added a splash of oat milk, and pressed play on the very first message. It was time-stamped at 11:45 last night. The audio crackled, and my father's voice filled the quiet kitchen. He was clinging desperately to his false authority. "Blair, pick up the phone right now," he barked, his voice trembling slightly with adrenaline. "There is a massive misunderstanding with the bank. Some idiot sheriff put a lockout notice on our front door. You need to call First Horizon immediately and tell them you authorized that loan. Tell them it was a verbal agreement. Fix this computer glitch right now, or I swear I will sue you for emotional distress and property damage. Do not test me, Blair. Pick up the phone." I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter notes, and calmly tapped the red trash can icon. Deleted. I moved my finger down the screen and selected a message left at 2:30 in the morning. The background noise was completely different. I could hear the heavy hum of Dion's vehicle engine and the faint sound of Whitney crying in the background. My father's tone had dramatically shifted from arrogant demands to frantic bargaining. "Blair, please," he stammered, the exhaustion evident in every syllable. "We are sitting in the car at a gas station. We cannot even buy a hotel room because every single credit card is frozen. Listen to me, sweetheart. I will pay you back. I will liquidate my entire retirement portfolio tomorrow morning and wire you the $300,000. I will give you $400,000. Just call the fraud department and tell them it was all a big mistake. Dion messed up the paperwork. It was Dion. Please, Blair. It is freezing out here. You cannot leave your pregnant sister sleeping in a parking lot. Call me back immediately. I stared out the windows at the bustling city below. I felt nothing. Deleted. I skipped over a dozen empty messages where he breathed heavily into the receiver and clicked on the final voicemail. It was recorded at 6:15 this morning, just as the sun was starting to rise over their shattered reality. The arrogant patriarch of the Kensington family was entirely gone. The man speaking into the phone was broken. He was openly weeping. Blair. He sobbed, his breath hitching painfully. The FBI just called my cell phone, an agent from the white-collar division. They are asking about an offshore cryptocurrency account in the Seychelles. Blair. I swear to God I do not know anything about a crypto account. I do not even know how to buy Bitcoin. Dion did this. Dion set me up. They are talking about wire fraud conspiracy, Blair. They are talking about 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I am 60 years old. I will die in prison. Please, my little girl, please save me. I am so sorry for everything. I am so sorry. Help me. The message abruptly cut off, likely because his battery finally died. I stood in my kitchen holding my warm mug. He finally knew the truth. He finally understood that the son-in-law he constantly praised had used him as a human shield. The panic in his voice was genuine, but his apology was worthless. He was not sorry for abusing me. He was not sorry for stealing my identity. He was only sorry he was facing the severe consequences of his actions. He gambled my freedom, and now he was going to lose his own. I tapped the screen one last time. Deleted. I locked my phone, finished my coffee, and went to get dressed for work. The atmosphere inside the cold, dark interior of Dion's luxury SUV was suffocating. Gary, Susan, Whitney, and Dion were parked in a generic hotel parking lot near the interstate, unable to even check into a room because every single piece of plastic they owned had been federally frozen. The engine was running solely to keep the heater on. It was 2:30 in the morning. Gary had finally given up calling my phone, his manic energy collapsing into a heavy, terrifying silence. Susan was asleep in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window, seeking refuge in unconsciousness. Whitney was curled up in the back seat, wrapped in a designer coat, staring blankly at the digital clock on the dashboard. Dion sat in the driver's seat, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. He appeared to be calmly assessing the situation, but internally, a massive survival instinct had entirely taken over. He knew exactly what a federal wire fraud conspiracy charge meant. It meant federal prison time. It meant the complete end of his fake entrepreneurial lifestyle. He had set Gary up to take the fall for the offshore cryptocurrency account, but the fact that the domestic bank had already seized the house meant the FBI was moving much faster than he ever anticipated. They would track the initial digital transfers back to him. He needed cash immediately. He needed to disappear before the sun came up and the federal warrants were officially executed. Dion slowly turned his head to check on the other passengers. Gary was staring out the window, completely broken. Susan was deeply asleep. Whitney's eyes were closed, her breathing slow and even. Dion reached down and quietly popped the latch for the rear cargo area. He needed the Louis Vuitton duffel bag Whitney had hurriedly thrown into the back when they were evicted from the house. He knew exactly what was inside that bag. While Susan was crying about her clothes, Whitney had methodically packed her most valuable assets. The engagement ring Dion had bought her using a fraudulent credit card, 2 diamond tennis bracelets, a vintage Cartier watch she had received from Gary for her 25th birthday. It was easily $60,000 worth of highly liquid assets sitting right in the trunk. Dion slowly opened his door, wincing as the interior lights flickered on. Going to stretch my legs, he whispered to Gary. Gary did not even acknowledge him. Dion slipped out into the freezing night air and walked quietly to the rear of the vehicle. He opened the liftgate carefully, ensuring it did not make a sound. He rummaged through the chaotic pile of designer coats and overnight bags until he found the distinctive brown canvas of the Louis Vuitton duffel. He unzipped it. The velvet jewelry boxes were stacked neatly at the bottom. He reached in and grabbed the boxes, shoving them quickly into the deep pockets of his own heavy winter coat. He planned to leave the SUV running walk 3 blocks down to the 24-hour pawn shop he had seen off the highway exit and disappear onto a Greyhound bus heading out of state before dawn. But Dion made one critical miscalculation. He severely underestimated the paranoia of a woman who had just lost absolutely everything. "What are you doing?" a sharp voice demanded from the darkness. Dion froze, his hand still inside his coat pocket, clutching the velvet boxes. He slowly turned around. Whitney was standing right behind him, the freezing wind whipping her blonde hair across her face. She was not crying anymore. Her eyes were completely clear, and they were locked directly onto the bulging pockets of his coat. "Just grabbing my phone charger," Dion lied smoothly, forcing a reassuring smile. "I am going to see if the gas station across the street has a functioning ATM. We need some cash for breakfast." Whitney did not buy it for a single second. She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "We do not have any cash in the accounts, Dion. Everything is frozen. What is in your pockets?" "Nothing, baby, just my gloves." Dion took a step back, his survival instinct screaming at him to run. Whitney lunged forward with surprising speed and grabbed the lapel of his coat. She yanked it hard, and the heavy velvet box containing the Cartier watch slipped from his pocket, hitting the asphalt with a loud, hollow thud. The box popped open, revealing the gleaming diamond face of the watch reflecting in the harsh parking lot lights. The silence that followed was absolute. Whitney stared at the watch on the ground, then looked up at the man she had married, the man she thought was a brilliant crypto investor, the man she had blindly followed into a massive federal fraud scheme just to fund her fake luxury lifestyle. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He was not just broke. He was abandoning her. He was stealing her remaining assets and leaving her to face the FBI completely alone. "You son of a bitch!" Whitney screamed, the sound tearing through the quiet night. "Dad, wake up! He is stealing the jewelry!" The doors of the SUV flew open. Gary stumbled out, his face pale and confused, but the sheer panic in Whitney's voice snapped him instantly awake. He saw the open trunk. He saw the watch on the ground. He saw the terrified, guilty look on his son-in-law's face. The fragile alliance that had held the toxic family together entirely evaporated in an instant. The internal betrayal was complete. Gary stared at the glittering diamond watch resting on the cold asphalt, his mind struggling to process the visual evidence of his golden son-in-law's absolute treachery. The freezing wind howled through the desolate hotel parking lot, but the chill that settled into Gary's bones had nothing to do with the weather. He looked from the watch to the bulging pockets of Dion's heavy winter coat. The realization was instantaneous and violent. Dion was not going to find an automated teller machine. He was stripping them of their final liquid assets to fund his own cowardly escape. "You miserable parasite!" Gary roared, his voice cracking with a mixture of sleep deprivation and absolute fury. He lunged forward, grabbing Dion by the collar of his coat. "Give me back my daughter's jewelry right now. You are not going anywhere." Dion did not cower. The polite, respectful facade he had maintained for years vanished in a single heartbeat. He shoved Gary backward with brutal force. Gary, an older man running on empty, stumbled and fell hard onto the icy pavement, scraping his palms raw. Dad, Whitney shrieked, rushing forward, but she stopped halfway, her eyes fixed on Dion. The man standing before her was a complete stranger. His eyes were cold, calculating, and completely devoid of the affection he normally performed for her social media videos. "Why are you doing this?" she sobbed, wrapping her arms around herself. "We are supposed to be a team, Dion. You said we were going to build an empire together. You said you loved me." Dion let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed loudly in the empty lot. "Loved you," he repeated, the contempt dripping from every syllable. "Are you genuinely that stupid, Whitney? Look around you. There is no empire. There never was an empire. I needed a clean financial vehicle to move capital, and you were the easiest, most gullible target I could possibly find." Whitney physically recoiled as if he had struck her across the face. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice trembling uncontrollably. "I am talking about your parents. Pristine 800 credit score." Dion snapped, stepping closer to her, forcing her to hear every single brutal word. That is what I married. I married a limitless line of credit. Do you actually think I enjoyed listening to you whine about your fake event planning business every single day? Do you think I cared about your pathetic need to impress strangers on the internet? You contributed absolutely nothing of value to our relationship except your last name. Whitney shook her head frantically, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. No, she gasped. That is not true. We were successful. We took trips. We bought nice things. We were happy. We were committing fraud. Dion yelled, his voice echoing off the brick walls of the cheap hotel. I used your blind vanity to max out credit cards and secure loans under your family's estate. You were so utterly obsessed with taking perfect photos for your followers and pretending to be a wealthy boss that you never once questioned where the cash was coming from. You just wanted the designer bags and the luxury vacations so you could feel superior to your sister. You were nothing but a convenient, shallow distraction while I structured the real money overseas. The sheer brutality of his confession shattered Whitney completely. Every single illusion she held about her perfect marriage, her successful business, and her flawless life disintegrated into dust right there on the freezing asphalt. She had spent years looking down on me, mocking my corporate job and my quiet life, firmly believing she was the ultimate winner. Now she was standing in a parking lot, entirely broke legally, tied to a massive federal crime, and realizing the man she loved had viewed her as nothing more than a disposable financial pawn. Her breathing turned into rapid, shallow gasps as a full-blown panic attack seized her chest, dropping her to her knees beside her bleeding father. Susan suddenly scrambled out of the passenger door, awakened by the screaming. She took one look at Gary on the ground and Dion clutching the stolen jewelry and began to scream hysterically for the police. "Help us, somebody, please help us!" Susan wailed wildly into the darkness. Dion did not waste another single second of his time. He bent down, snatched the Cartier watch off the pavement, and shoved it back into his pocket. He turned his back on the weeping women and the defeated patriarch. Without a single look back, he sprinted across the dark parking lot, disappearing into the shadows of the adjacent highway on-ramp, leaving Whitney to face the total catastrophic collapse of her entire fake reality completely alone. Susan stood in the freezing parking lot, her manic screams for the police dying in the cold air as Dion's figure disappeared into the shadows. She looked down at Gary, who was still kneeling weakly on the icy asphalt with his bleeding palms, and then over at Whitney, who was hyperventilating next to the dropped velvet jewelry box. Instead of rushing to comfort her devastated daughter or help her injured husband, Susan's mind simply snapped. The human brain can process only so much trauma before it builds a wall of delusion to survive the sheer horror. Susan built her wall instantly. She smoothed the front of her designer coat, her breathing returning to a calm, rhythmic pace. "He is just going to find a police officer," Susan announced, her voice completely devoid of the panic that had consumed her just moments ago. "He is a good man. He is going to get help to fix this horrible computer misunderstanding." Whitney looked up at her mother, her mascara smeared across her pale face. "Mom, are you insane?" Whitney choked out, her voice cracking. "He just robbed us. He admitted to everything. He set Dad up for a federal crime, and he ran away." Susan waved her hand dismissively, exactly like she used to do whenever I tried to express my feelings as a child. "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Whitney. Dion is simply stressed because of the bank error. He will be back. We just need to get organized before he returns." She turned toward the running luxury vehicle and climbed right into the driver's seat. "Gary, get in the car. We are going back to the house." Gary slowly picked himself up from the pavement, wincing in pain. "Susan, we cannot go back there." The sheriff locked the doors. "We are locked out." "Nonsense." Susan snapped, her eyes wide and disconnected from reality. "I left the back patio door unlocked this morning for the landscaping crew. I need to pack the Royal Doulton china. We cannot leave the fine china sitting in the house during a move. It was a wedding gift from my grandmother. If we do not pack it properly right now, the movers will chip the gold rim. Gary stared at his wife, absolutely horrified. We are not moving, Susan. The bank foreclosed on our estate. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is coming for me. Susan slammed her manicured hand against the leather steering wheel. Get in the car right now, Gary. We have to secure the china before the morning sun comes up. Defeated and broken, Gary silently helped Whitney into the back seat and climbed into the passenger side. Susan threw the heavy vehicle into drive and sped recklessly out of the hotel parking lot, running a solid red light as she headed straight back to the Oak Brook suburbs. Her eyes were fixed intensely on the dark road, completely ignoring the heartbreaking tears of her favorite daughter. When they finally arrived back at the dark-seized mansion, Susan did not hesitate for a single second. She marched straight across the frozen front lawn, bypassing the eviction notice, and headed to the backyard patio. Finding the heavy glass door securely locked by the bank contractors, she picked up a heavy cast-iron garden gnome and smashed it directly through the double-paned glass. The loud sound of shattering glass pierced the quiet, wealthy suburban neighborhood. Gary yelled her name in terror, fearful that the local police would arrive, but Susan was already climbing recklessly through the jagged opening, completely ignoring the sharp shards cutting into her expensive leather boots. She stumbled into the dark, freezing kitchen and immediately started pulling open the custom cherry wood cabinets. She grabbed the expensive porcelain plates and began haphazardly shoving them into a black plastic trash bag she found under the sink. The fragile plates clattered and violently shattered against each other inside the thin bag, completely destroying the valuable heirloom she claimed to be saving. This is all Blair's fault, Susan muttered frantically, her hands visibly shaking as she tossed more expensive crystal wine glasses into the garbage bag. She completely cursed us. She is a bitter, jealous girl. She just could not stand seeing you happily married, Whitney. She could not stand seeing us succeed. She told the commercial bank horrible lies to curse this family. She is trying to ruin my dining set because she does not have one. Gary stood frozen in the shattered doorway, watching his wife destroy thousands of dollars worth of fine china in absolute darkness, frantically mumbling about a magical curse while their entire lives collapsed around them. Susan held up a broken porcelain teacup, her hands bleeding from the sharp glass, completely lost in a terminal state of absolute denial. The cold, harsh light of dawn broke through the shattered glass of the patio door, illuminating the wreckage of the once pristine kitchen. Susan sat on the marble floor, her hands bleeding, clutching a garbage bag full of destroyed porcelain. Gary stood beside her, staring blankly at the wall, the fight drained from his body. Whitney was curled into a ball on the rug, shivering in her designer coat. The manic energy of the night evaporated, leaving a crushing, suffocating reality. The silence of the suburban morning was abruptly shattered by heavy tires crunching on the gravel driveway, followed by the authoritative slam of car doors. Gary flinched, stepping toward the window. 2 Oak Brook police cruisers were parked at steep angles across the front lawn. Right behind them was a flatbed tow truck and a black sedan bearing the logo of First Horizon National Bank. The federal eviction deadline had arrived, and the bank was not wasting a single second securing their multi-million-dollar collateral. A county sheriff deputy walked directly to the back patio, his boots crunching loudly over the broken glass Susan smashed hours earlier. He unclipped his radio, his expression completely hardened. Gary Kensington, the deputy, announced, stepping into the kitchen. You and your family are criminally trespassing on seized federal collateral. You have exactly 5 minutes to vacate this premises before I place all of you under arrest for breaking and entering. Susan blinked, looking up from her bag of broken plates. We live here, she whispered, her voice devoid of its usual arrogant sting. This is our home. Not anymore, ma'am, the deputy replied coldly. The bank took legal possession of this property at midnight. Move. Now. At that exact moment, a second police cruiser pulled up to the curb. The back door opened and an officer pulled a shivering, miserable figure out of the back seat. It was Dion. He had not made it very far. The local police picked him up, wandering aimlessly along the freezing shoulder of the interstate. Since he had no cash, no working credit cards, and refused to answer questions, they ran his identification and brought him straight back to his registered address. He looked entirely pathetic, his grand escape ruined by the freezing Chicago weather and his absolute lack of actual survival skills. Whitney saw him being escorted up the driveway and let out a sound that was half sob, half furious scream. "You coward," she yelled, but she did not even have the energy to run at him. She collapsed against the brick exterior of the house, thoroughly defeated. Gary grabbed the heavy plastic trash bags filled with Susan's broken china. It was the only physical property they were leaving with. The deputy corralled the four of them down the front steps, treating them exactly like common criminals. They shuffled down the pristine driveway in complete silence. The affluent neighbors they spent decades trying to impress were now standing on their manicured lawns, holding morning coffees, openly watching the Kensington family be completely humiliated. Gary marched toward the heavy black G-Wagon, intending to throw the trash bags into the trunk so they could drive away and hide from the staring neighbors. But as he reached for the door handle, a large man in a high-visibility vest stepped directly in his path. "Step away from the vehicle," the man ordered, holding up a clipboard. "This is my son-in-law's car." Gary snapped, a fraction of his old arrogance flaring up. "Get out of my way." The man shook his head and gestured to the flatbed tow truck backing up to the luxury SUV. "This vehicle is leased through a commercial financing company," he explained loudly. "The account is severely delinquent and the federal freeze flagged it for repossession. The car does not belong to you, and it certainly does not belong to him." Dion stood there, his jaw clenched, unable to dispute the repo agent. The facade was entirely gone. "You can pull your personal belongings out of the cabin," the agent continued, "but the vehicle is leaving on my truck right now." The four of them stood on the freezing concrete, entirely stripped of their pride. Gary silently opened the back door of the SUV and pulled out the few overnight bags they hastily packed the day before. He dropped them onto the driveway next to the garbage bags of broken plates. The tow truck hydraulic winch engaged with a loud mechanical whine. The four of them watched in absolute silence as the shiny black symbol of Dion's fake wealth was dragged forcefully onto the flatbed. Homeless, disgraced, and completely out of options, Gary, Susan, Whitney, and Dion stood on the sidewalk surrounded by garbage bags. They had absolutely nowhere to go. Exactly 1 week passed since the night my father stood in my kitchen and loudly disowned me. A lot can happen in 7 days. For me, it was a peaceful week. For my toxic family, it was a rapid, brutal descent into absolute hell. My attorney Thomas kept me updated. They spent the last 7 nights bouncing between cheap motels paid for by whatever cash Dion hid in his shoes, constantly looking over their shoulders for federal agents. The reality of their situation had finally crushed their arrogance. It was Friday evening, and a massive thunderstorm had rolled off Lake Michigan, pounding downtown Chicago with torrential rain and freezing wind. I was in my kitchen wearing comfortable silk pajamas, brewing chamomile tea. The soft jazz playing through my sound system was interrupted by the sharp buzz of my intercom. I pressed the security camera button. My condo featured a private ground-level terrace entrance opening directly onto a secure courtyard. The night vision camera displayed 4 miserable, soaking wet figures standing outside my heavy glass terrace door, completely exposed to the relentless storm. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I picked up my mug of tea and walked slowly across the living room. I reached the terrace door and flipped the switch for the exterior floodlights. The sudden bright light illuminated their pathetic state. My mother, who only a week ago was dining at a Michelin star restaurant, wore a damp, wrinkled sweater, her hair plastered against her face. Whitney looked hollow and exhausted, clinging to Dion, who shivered violently in a cheap poncho. Gary Kensington, the man who used to terrorize our household, looked like a broken, terrified old man. I unlatched the deadbolt and pulled the glass door open just a few inches, staying in the warm, dry comfort of my home, while the freezing rain lashed against the porch. "Blair!" My father choked out his voice, barely audible over the roaring thunder. "Thank God you are here. Please let us come inside. We are freezing. You are trespassing on private property, I said, my voice as calm as the storm was violent. You have exactly 30 seconds to tell me why you are standing on my porch before I trigger the building security alarm. Gary did not yell. He did not threaten me or call me a selfish brat. Instead, the patriarch of the family collapsed. His knees buckled, hitting the wet concrete porch with a heavy thud. He fell forward, resting his scraped hands against the glass pane, tears streaming down his face, mixing heavily with the freezing rain. I am begging you, Gary sobbed, his chest heaving with despair. I am begging you on my hands and knees. Look at what has happened to us. Federal agents found the offshore crypto ledger. They seized Dion's passport and my passport yesterday. My attorney says they are drafting federal indictments for wire fraud right now. We have absolutely nothing left. The bank took the cars, the house, the accounts. We are sleeping in a filthy motel. Please, sweetheart. You are the only one who can stop this nightmare. Call First Horizon National Bank. Tell federal investigators you gave us verbal permission to use your signature. Tell them it was a massive misunderstanding. I will owe you my life. My mother pushed forward, grabbing the doorframe. We are your family, she pleaded, her voice shrill and desperate over the crashing rain. We raised you. You cannot send your own flesh and blood to a federal penitentiary. Whitney's baby will grow up without a grandfather. Dion will go to jail. We will do whatever you want, Blair. We will sign everything over to you. We will publicly apologize. Just retract the fraud claim and save us from this hell. I stood holding my warm mug of tea, looking down at the people who had abused me, manipulated me, and tried to completely destroy my life for their own selfish gain. They were not genuinely sorry for the crimes they committed. They were only sorry the brutal consequences finally caught up to them. They expected the old traumatized Blair to cave to the pressure, to feel overwhelming guilt, to rescue them from the blazing fire they intentionally started. But that version of me was dead. I looked my father directly in his weeping eyes, watching the rain wash away the last shreds of his toxic arrogance. The silence stretched between us, heavier than the pouring storm. I did not sue you, I stated calmly, my voice slicing through the heavy rain. You committed a severe federal crime. The federal government is prosecuting you, and it is entirely too late. Gary's hands slid down the wet glass of my terrace door, leaving smeared streaks in the condensation. The absolute finality of my words seemed to crush whatever remaining strength he had left. He stared up at me from the cold concrete, his mouth opening and closing completely, unable to process the reality of the American legal system. What do you mean it is too late? He whispered, his voice cracking. You are the victim here. You can tell them you do not want to press any charges. People drop charges all the time, Blair. Please, just pick up your phone right now and call the bank. You still do not understand what you actually did, I replied, taking a deliberate sip of my chamomile tea. This is not a simple domestic dispute. You conspired to defraud a bank out of $300,000 using a federal commercial loan. And then I shifted my gaze to Dion. You wired those funds across international borders into an unregulated cryptocurrency exchange in the Seychelles. The digital forensic trail is ironclad. You handed the federal government a perfectly packaged felony. My mother gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her freezing hands. She looked wildly at Dion, then back at me. But we are family, she pleaded, repeating her tired mantra. The government does not care about family drama. They will listen to you if you just explain. The Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation do not care about our family tree. Susan, I said, intentionally using her first name. They care about wire fraud. Once I submitted the digital dossier proving the Internet Protocol address used to submit the fraudulent application belonged to your residential network, the case was out of my hands. I am merely a witness now. The United States Department of Justice is pressing the criminal charges against you. I cannot stop a federal indictment. You cannot unring a bell that loud. Whitney pushed violently past our mother, stepping right up to the slight opening of the glass door. Her designer coat was completely ruined, soaked entirely through with freezing rain. You planned this, she screamed. her desperation turning into uncontrollable anger. "You knew the bank would seize the suburban house. You wanted to see me out on the street." I let out a short laugh. "Are you really still trying to play the pregnancy card right now, Whitney?" I pulled up your expensive cosmetic injectable receipt in front of my office just last week. "We both know you are not pregnant. Your entire life is a carefully constructed lie built exclusively on the stolen resources of other people. Now you finally have to live in the reality you created. There are no more bailouts." Whitney flinched hard, stepping backward as if I had physically struck her. The last weapon in her manipulative arsenal was neutralized. She looked around the dark, stormy courtyard, realizing there was absolutely no audience left to perform for. No one was going to save her from the storm. "Blair, I will do anything," my father begged, his wet forehead resting heavily against the glass pane. "I will sign a full confession stating I acted completely alone. I will tell the investigators your mother and sister knew absolutely nothing about it. Just let them stay inside here tonight." "You do not get to dictate the terms of your surrender, Gary," I stated coldly. "You stood in my kitchen exactly 1 week ago and told me I was dead to you because I refused to fund a criminal enterprise. I simply accepted your terms. I am honoring your exact wishes. You are looking at a complete stranger right now. A stranger who owes you absolutely nothing, not even a dry blanket or a glass of water." Dion finally spoke up, his teeth chattering uncontrollably from the freezing wind. "You are enjoying this," he spat bitterly, wrapping his thin poncho tighter around himself. "You are standing in your warm luxury apartment, drinking hot tea, watching us freeze to death. You are a complete corporate psychopath." "I am not enjoying anything, Dion," I corrected him, my expression remaining neutral. "I am simply observing the inevitable consequences of your own arrogant decisions. You thought you could orchestrate a massive laundering scheme and use an innocent woman as your financial shield. You played an illegal game, and you lost absolutely everything." I took one final slow sip of my tea, savoring the quiet warmth of my beautiful home. The pouring rain continued to beat down heavily on their shivering shoulders. Gary let out a low moan of sheer despair, finally comprehending that absolutely no amount of fake tears would ever unlock this glass door. He was entirely trapped in the legal nightmare he had built exclusively for me. Gary remained slumped against the wet glass, his chest heaving with defeated sobs, when the atmosphere in the courtyard suddenly shifted. The steady rhythm of the pouring rain was overpowered by the roar of heavy engines turning onto the private access road. Through the sheets of freezing water, intense beams of white light swept across the dark pavement. Then came the flashing red and blue strobe lights cutting through the storm and reflecting off every wet surface. The blinding colors painted the terrified faces of my family. Two massive black Federal sport utility vehicles parked at sharp angles, completely blocking the exit. Gary slowly turned his head, his deeply terrified face catching the flashing lights. He froze completely, his eyes widening in absolute horror. Susan let out a piercing shriek and grabbed Whitney by the arm, trying to pull her daughter behind the meager shelter of a decorative concrete planter. Dion did not scream. He did not cry. He simply took a slow step backward into the deepest shadows of the patio, his survival instincts telling him to run, even though there was absolutely nowhere left to hide. The heavy doors of the vehicles swung open in perfect unison. 6 figures stepped out into the torrential downpour. They wore dark tactical windbreakers with 3 bold yellow letters printed across their backs. FBI. They moved with ruthless precision, entirely unbothered by the freezing rain soaking their clothes. I stood quietly inside my warm living room, my hands wrapped around my ceramic mug, watching the final act of this tragedy unfold. I knew exactly why the Federal Bureau of Investigation had arrived instead of the local Chicago police. When Dion executed his plan to steal the $300,000 commercial loan, he made fatal jurisdictional errors. He used the federal banking system to process the fraudulent funds. Then, trying to be clever, he initiated a complex web of wire transfers. He routed the stolen money through offshore holding accounts in the Cayman Islands to obscure the origin of the cash before dumping the entire sum into the unregulated Seychelles cryptocurrency exchange under my father's name. By utilizing international wire transfers and routing stolen government funds through the Cayman Islands, Dion elevated a simple case of domestic identity theft into a massive money laundering and federal wire fraud conspiracy. He triggered the jurisdiction of the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country. The lead agent, a tall man with a stern face and a waterproof tactical vest, marched directly toward the huddled group on my patio. He did not carry an umbrella. He did not look sympathetic. He stopped exactly 5 feet away from my father, the flashing red and blue lights illuminating the silver badge clipped to his belt. Gary Kensington, the lead agent, shouted, his authoritative voice easily cutting through the loud crashes of thunder. Gary could not even find the strength to stand up. He remained on his knees in the puddles of freezing rain, his hands shaking violently at his sides. Yes, Gary whispered, his voice so weak it was barely audible. I am Gary. The agent immediately pulled a thick stack of folded documents from his waterproof jacket. I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of aggravated identity theft, bank fraud, and conspiracy to commit international wire fraud, the agent announced, reading the charges with absolute clinical detachment. Susan threw herself forward, completely losing her mind. No, she screamed, waving her arms frantically at the federal agents. You have the wrong person. He is a respected businessman. He belongs to the country club. My daughter Blair did this to us. Arrest her. She set us up. The agents entirely ignored my mother's unhinged rant. 2 officers stepped past her, moving swiftly toward the dark corner of the patio where Dion was trying to press himself flat against the brick wall. Dion, the second agent, called out, shining a high-powered tactical flashlight directly into the cowardly con artist's face. Keep your hands exactly where I can see them. Step away from the wall immediately. Dion squeezed his eyes shut against the blinding beam of the flashlight. The confident, wealthy cryptocurrency investor who had mocked me and used my family as a disposable financial shield was entirely gone. He was just a terrified con artist caught in a trap he had built himself. He slowly raised his empty hands into the cold air, stepping out from the shadows and into the relentless rain. Whitney watched her husband surrender, her face completely blank, the reality of her shattered life finally destroying her remaining delusions. I stood completely still on the other side of the glass door, sipping my warm chamomile tea, watching the federal agents surround the men who had promised to ruin my life. The agents advanced, their heavy tactical boots splashing loudly in the accumulating puddles on the concrete patio. The lead agent kept his flashlight trained directly on Dion, who was standing perfectly still with his hands raised in the freezing air. But as a second agent reached to his belt to unholster a pair of heavy steel handcuffs, the sheer terror of spending the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary finally broke through Dion's paralyzed state. His primal survival instinct completely overrode any remaining logical thought in his head. He dropped his hands, spun on his heel, and sprinted toward the wrought iron gate at the edge of the courtyard. He did not make it very far at all. A third federal agent who had silently flanked the perimeter of the terrace anticipated the desperate move. The agent lunged forward with devastating speed and precision, hitting Dion at full force. The impact lifted Dion entirely off his feet. They crashed violently into the flooded, muddy landscaping grass adjacent to my patio. Dion gasped for air as the breath was knocked completely out of his lungs. He thrashed wildly in the wet mud, his expensive designer clothes instantly ruined, but he was completely outmatched by the trained officer. The agent drove a knee sharply into Dion's back, pinning him firmly to the soaking earth. Stop resisting immediately or the charges will escalate, the agent barked aggressively, wrenching Dion's arms behind his back. Dion let out a pathetic, suffocated sob, his face pressed deep into the freezing mud. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed over the sound of the rain. The brilliant financial mastermind was officially reduced to a weeping criminal pinned to the ground. With Dion physically secured, the lead agent turned his absolute and undivided attention back to my father. Gary had not moved an inch, He remained firmly planted on his knees, his hands trembling at his sides, watching his son-in-law get tackled into the dirt. The agent reached down, grabbed Gary roughly by the bicep, and hauled him up to his feet. Gary Kensington, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and international money laundering. The agent stated, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. No, please listen to me. Gary stammered, his eyes darting frantically between the agent and the glass door where I was standing. I am the victim here. Dion set me up. I do not own any offshore accounts. I do not understand how digital currency works. You have to believe me. The agent spun Gary around, forcing his hands behind his back. We have the decrypted registration documents for Apex Global Holdings in the Seychelles. The agent replied coldly, seamlessly continuing the formal Miranda warning. Your full legal name, your date of birth, and your social security number are listed as the primary beneficiary and master account holder for the laundered Small Business Association funds. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand the rights I have just read to you? I am a respected member of this community. Gary sobbed, his chest heaving as the cold steel bracelets ratcheted tightly around his wrists. The clicking sound was the absolute final nail in the coffin of his arrogance. I do not have a criminal record. Please do not put those on me. Susan could not bear the sight of her husband being restrained. She lunged forward, grabbing the sleeve of the arresting agent. Take those off him right now, she screamed hysterically, completely disregarding the severe danger of interfering with a federal arrest. He has high blood pressure. You are going to give him a heart attack. A female agent immediately stepped in, grabbing Susan by the shoulders and shoving her firmly backward. Step back immediately, or you will be charged with assaulting a federal officer, she ordered sharply. Susan stumbled back, clutching her chest, her hands shaking wildly as she watched her entire world evaporate into the stormy night. Whitney stood entirely frozen near the concrete planter. She did not cry out for her husband as they hauled him out of the mud. She did not rush to comfort her mother. She simply stared at the flashing red and blue lights, watching the two men who had defined her entire identity get stripped of their freedom, their dignity, and their fake wealth. I watched my father being marched slowly toward the massive black SUV, his head hanging low in absolute disgrace. The massive black federal vehicles vibrated with raw mechanical power as the agents forcefully shoved Gary and Dion into the reinforced back seats. The heavy armored doors slammed shut with a definitive metallic thud that echoed over the crashing thunder. My father pressed his face against the dark-tinted window for one brief, agonizing second, his eyes desperately searching the dark courtyard for a miracle that was never going to arrive. He looked incredibly small, entirely stripped of the arrogant patriarchal power he had wielded over me for my entire life. The lead agent climbed into the driver's seat and put the vehicle into gear. The flashing red and blue strobe lights painted the brick walls of my patio one final time before the federal SUVs pulled away, accelerating rapidly down the private access road and disappearing completely into the violent Chicago storm. The deafening roar of their engines faded, leaving only the relentless sound of the freezing rain pounding against the pavement. My mother let out a guttural, agonizing wail that sounded entirely inhuman. The pristine image obsessed suburban socialite completely vanished in that exact moment. Susan collapsed onto her hands and knees in the freezing mud, completely ruining her expensive designer sweater and imported leather boots. She clawed at the wet grass, sobbing uncontrollably as the absolute reality of her situation finally crushed her. There would be no country club lawyers to fix this. There would be no smooth talking her way out of federal indictments. Her husband was going to a federal penitentiary, her massive estate was seized by the bank, and her perfect reputation was permanently destroyed. She was absolutely nothing now. Whitney remained standing near the concrete planter, shivering so violently her teeth audibly chattered. She stared at the empty driveway where the federal vehicles had just vanished, her mascara running in dark, jagged rivers down her pale cheeks. The fake designer empire she had sacrificed my identity to build was completely obliterated. Her fraudulent marriage was exposed as a calculated grift. She had absolutely no money, no shelter, and no future. Slowly, she turned her head and looked back at the only source of light left in her entire world. She looked at me. I remained perfectly still in the doorway, the warm, soft light of my living room spilling out into the dark, freezing courtyard. I held my ceramic mug, the steam rising gently into the air, completely untouched by the chaos unfolding just a few feet away. Whitney took a hesitant, trembling step toward the porch. "Blair," she whimpered, her voice cracking with profound desperation. "Blair, please. You have to let us inside. We have absolutely nowhere to go. The bank took our phones. We do not have a single dollar. We are going to freeze to death out here in the storm." Susan lifted her head from the mud, her face contorted with panic and despair. "Please, sweetheart," my mother begged, crawling slightly toward the edge of the patio. "We are so sorry. We were wrong. We are your blood. We are your family. You cannot leave your own mother out in the freezing rain. Have some mercy." I looked down at the two miserable women weeping on my property. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindication. I did not feel the urge to scream or gloat about my victory. I felt an overwhelming, beautiful sense of complete emptiness. The invisible tethers of guilt, obligation, and fear that had kept me bound to their toxic dynamic for over 3 decades were permanently severed. They were not begging for my forgiveness because they loved me. They were begging for shelter because they had completely exhausted every other available host. They were parasites who had finally killed their golden goose, and now they were desperately searching for a warm place to survive the winter. I looked Whitney dead in her terrified, pleading eyes. The silence stretched between us for a long moment, completely unbroken by the raging storm. "You are not my family," I stated, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "Family does not steal your identity. Family does not use you as a human shield for federal crimes. You made your choices, and now you are going to live with the consequences entirely on your own." I took a deliberate step backward into the warm, safe sanctuary of my home. I reached out and grabbed the brass handle of my heavy oak door. Whitney screamed my name, lunging forward with her hand outstretched, desperate to catch the edge of the frame. She was entirely too slow. I pulled the heavy oak door shut right in their faces. The solid wood silenced their pathetic screams instantly. I reached up and turned the solid metal deadbolt with a loud, satisfying click, locking them out of my life forever. 6 months passed since the night I locked that heavy oak door. The satisfying click of the metal deadbolt remained the defining sound of my absolute freedom. I sat behind the massive glass desk in my new corner office, looking out over the sprawling Chicago skyline. The autumn sun reflected off the lake, casting a brilliant light across the financial district. I was no longer just a senior risk analyst. The executive board had reviewed my handling of the highly publicized First Horizon fraud case and decided my unparalleled ability to trace obfuscated digital assets belonged at the absolute top of the corporate hierarchy. I was currently reviewing the final contract for my promotion to Chief Information Security Officer. The compensation package was staggering, but the profound silence in my personal life was worth infinitely more than the stock options. The wheels of the federal justice system ground slowly, but they crushed absolutely everything in their path. The United States Department of Justice did not offer leniency to arrogant men who stole from the Small Business Association. Dion tried to negotiate a plea deal by flipping on my father, desperately attempting to spin a narrative where Gary was the criminal mastermind behind the Seychelles cryptocurrency exchange. The federal prosecutors openly laughed at him. Ryan's forensic dossier had perfectly outlined Dion's meticulous structuring of the domestic wire transfers. Both men were indicted on multiple felony counts of wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and money laundering. The trial concluded just 3 weeks ago. Gary Kensington, the man who spent his entire life demanding respect and terrifying his family, stood before a federal judge and wept like a child as the sentence was handed down. He received 84 months in a medium-security federal correctional institution. 7 years of wearing a standard issue uniform entirely stripped of his country club prestige and his tailored suits. Dion fared significantly worse. Because he orchestrated the international flight of capital and violently attempted to flee from arresting agents, the judge handed him a brutal 120 months. 10 solid years behind bars. I watched from the gallery as they were led out of the courtroom in heavy iron shackles, their fake empire completely reduced to federal inmate identification numbers. With the estate fully repossessed and the remaining assets seized to pay back the commercial bank, the women of the Kensington family faced a terrifying new reality. They actually had to work. Susan was immediately excommunicated from her wealthy social circles. The country club canceled her membership the very morning the local news broadcasted Gary's arrest. Completely destitute and functionally unemployable, she was forced to move into a tiny rundown apartment complex on the far outskirts of the city, surviving strictly on a depleted government check. She spent her days aggressively arguing with strangers in online comment sections, still desperately trying to blame a magical curse for her spectacular downfall. But the most profound poetic justice was reserved entirely for Whitney. The fake event planning business was officially dissolved by the state. The designer handbags, the diamond watches, and the luxury vehicles were all seized by the bankruptcy courts. Stripped of her stolen resources and the grand illusion of a wealthy husband, she had to face the brutal, exhausting reality of the actual working class. She was currently employed at a fast fashion retail store inside a dying suburban shopping mall. The woman who used to mock my corporate career and fake a pregnancy for social media sympathy now spent 40 hours a week wearing a cheap polyester uniform lanyard. She spent her long, agonizing shifts standing on her feet, folding clearance rack sweaters, scanning barcodes, and being verbally berated by angry customers over expired coupon codes. Her manager, a college student 10 years younger than her, constantly reprimanded her for taking too many breaks. There were no more luxury vacations to the Maldives. There were no more expensive cosmetic injectables. Her Instagram account was permanently deleted after the comments section was flooded with news articles detailing her husband's federal wire fraud conviction. She was completely anonymous, broke and exhausted. I turned my attention back to the thick leather-bound contract resting on my desk. I picked up my favorite silver pen and signed my name on the bottom line with a smooth, practiced flourish. The signature that my toxic family tried to weaponize to destroy my life was now officially securing my financial future at the highest executive level. I closed the leather folder and leaned back in my ergonomic chair. I reached over to the small crystal ice bucket resting on the edge of my credenza. Inside sat a perfectly chilled bottle of vintage Dom Perignon, a congratulatory gift from my managing director. I popped the cork with a soft, muted sigh and poured the sparkling golden liquid into a crystal flute. The tiny bubbles rose rapidly to the surface, catching the bright afternoon sunlight. I raised the glass toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a silent, solitary toast to the breathtaking beauty of absolute karma. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the champagne. It tasted exactly like victory.